Everyone knows the story. The Library of Alexandria burned, and with it, the greatest collection of ancient knowledge ever assembled vanished into smoke. One tragic fire, one moment of loss, one villain to blame. Except that's not what happened, not even close. The truth is far stranger and far more unsettling. The Library of Alexandria didn't burn once. It was destroyed, damaged, defunded, and forgotten across 5 separate timelines spanning nearly 700 years. And historians still argue bitterly about which one actually mattered, which one is myth, and which one we've gotten completely wrong for centuries. Think about that. Julius Caesar, a Roman emperor named Aurelian, a Christian mob in 391 CE, the brutal murder of a female mathematician named Hypatia, and finally an Arab conquest legend that's been repeated as fact for 1,000 years, despite almost no evidence supporting it. 5 moments, 5 different centuries, 5 wildly different stories about how humanity lost its greatest repository of knowledge. And here's the unsettling part. Most of what you think you know is probably wrong. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I check the comments constantly, and it's wild seeing London at midnight, Manila at sunrise, Toronto at dinner, all reading the same words at completely different moments. It's one of my favourite parts of doing this, before we dive in. If mysteries like this one keep you up at night, I've put together a book covering 12 unexplained mysteries just like this, the ones historians still can't agree on. You'll find the link in the description if you want to go deeper. Now, if you're enjoying these stories, the best way to support the show is by following on Spotify, listening there, and leaving a 5-star review if it's your kind of thing. Links in the description too. So let's go back, not just once, but 5 times. Because the Library of Alexandria didn't die in a single afternoon. It died slowly, painfully, across centuries, and nobody can agree on exactly how. Let's start where the story always starts, with the man everyone loves to blame, Julius Caesar, 48 BCE. And here's the thing, he actually admitted to it. That's rare in ancient history. Usually you're piecing together fragments, guessing at motives, reading between the lines of biased historians centuries removed from the events they're describing. But Caesar himself, in his own account of the Alexandrian War, tells us he set ships on fire in the harbour. He doesn't deny it, he doesn't try to hide it. He writes about it almost casually, like it was just another tactical decision in a long campaign of tactical decisions. Which, if you think about it, is exactly what makes this whole mystery so maddening. Picture Alexandria in the winter of 48 BCE. This isn't some backwater outpost. This is the crown jewel of the Mediterranean world, a city of maybe 500,000 people, wide paved streets, a harbour so sophisticated it had multiple basins for different types of ships, and towering over everything, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, its fire visible from miles out at sea. This is where Caesar found himself, not as a conquering hero marching in triumph, but as a man trapped, badly outnumbered, and fighting for his life. Here's how he got there. Caesar had pursued his rival Pompey to Egypt after defeating him at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey didn't make it far. Egyptian courtiers, trying to curry favour with the apparent winner of Rome's civil war, had Pompey murdered the moment he stepped off his ship, then presented his head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar, according to several ancient sources, was horrified rather than pleased. Whether that horror was genuine grief or political theatre, we'll never know for certain. But what happened next is clearer. Caesar inserted himself into Egypt's own civil war, the messy power struggle between the teenage pharaoh Ptolemy XIII and his sister, a young woman you might have heard of, Cleopatra. Caesar sided with Cleopatra. That decision, that one alliance, is going to matter a lot in a few minutes, because it put him directly at odds with the Egyptian royal court, the Egyptian army, and quite possibly a significant portion of Alexandria's population. Caesar had marched into the city with a relatively small force, something like 4,000 men, expecting the situation to be manageable. It wasn't Egyptian forces, loyal to Ptolemy, moved to trap Caesar and his soldiers inside the royal quarter of the city, right along the waterfront. Suddenly, the man who had conquered Gaul, who had crossed the Rubicon and taken Rome itself, found himself besieged in a foreign city, cut off, outnumbered, with his back literally against the sea. This is the moment that matters. This is the moment historians still argue about almost 2,000 years later. Because Caesar, seeing the Egyptian fleet in the harbour, a fleet that could have been used to reinforce his enemies or block his own escape and resupply routes, made a decision. He ordered the ships burned. Now, burning ships in a harbour sounds simple enough. Torch the vessels, watch them sink, problem solved. But think about the physical reality of Alexandria's waterfront at that moment. This wasn't some isolated dock in the middle of nowhere. The harbour sat right at the edge of the royal district, an area packed with palaces, government buildings, temples and warehouses. Ancient Mediterranean cities built close together, wood and stone crammed side by side, streets narrow enough that fire could leap from one structure to another with terrifying speed. And this was a windy season on a notoriously windy stretch of coastline. Caesar's own account, written afterward, focuses on the tactical necessity. He needed to stop the Egyptian fleet from being used against him. He needed to control the harbour to keep his supply lines to Rome open. From a purely military standpoint, it made sense. But Caesar wasn't writing a comprehensive damage report. He was writing a justification for his own actions, a document meant to shape how Rome remembered this campaign. And that's exactly the problem historians keep running into. We have the arsonist's own testimony, but we don't have an independent damage assessment. What we do know is that the fire spread. Ancient sources describe flames moving from the ships into the dockyards, then into buildings near the waterfront. This wasn't a contained surgical strike. Fire in the ancient world almost never was. Once flame gets loose in a densely built harbour district, especially one full of wooden ships, rope, pitch, sailcloth, and stored grain, it becomes almost impossible to control. The same materials that made Alexandria's harbour one of the most sophisticated ports in the ancient Mediterranean. All that timber, all that flammable cargo, all those closely packed warehouses also made it a fire trap waiting for a spark. So here's where we stand after just this first piece of the puzzle. We have a Roman general, trapped in a foreign city, making an admitted decision to burn enemy ships for military reasons. We have a harbour district built close enough together that fire could spread far beyond its original target. And we have Caesar's own writings confirming the fire happened without ever mentioning what else might have burned along with it. That silence, that gap in the historical record, is exactly where the controversy begins. Because just a stone's throw from that burning harbour stood some of the greatest repositories of written knowledge the ancient world had ever produced. And this is where the story splits into competing versions. Not modern versions, ancient versions. The people closest to the Roman world, writing in Greek and Latin, could not even agree on what Caesar's fire had consumed. The earliest surviving accounts are strangely restrained. Caesar says, ships burned, the continuation of his campaign history written by someone in his circle, describes fighting around Alexandria in detail. But neither text stops to say, and the greatest library on earth was destroyed. That doesn't prove no books burned. Ancient military narratives leave out plenty. But it does mean the most immediate voices give us no clear obituary for the library. Then about a century later, The Roman philosopher Seneca drops a number into the story. In a work about the mind and memory of all places, he says that 40,000 books were burned at Alexandria. He doesn't describe the flames. He doesn't name the building. He doesn't tell us whether these were royal collections, commercial stockpiles, copies awaiting shipment, or records stored near the docks. He simply gives us this astonishing image. 40,000 books gone. And already you can feel the problem. What did books mean in Alexandria? Not bound volumes with printed pages. These were mostly papyrus scrolls. A single work might require several scrolls, a long history, a collection of speeches, a philosophical dialogue, a scientific treatise. Each could be copied across multiple rolls, and the same text might exist in several copies, corrected copies, annotated copies, copies made for export, copies waiting to be catalogued. So when an ancient author says 40,000 books, they may be counting individual scrolls. They may be counting works. They may be repeating a figure they heard without knowing precisely what it measured. But Seneca's line is important for another reason. He was not writing some medieval legend hundreds of years after the fact. He lived under the early Roman Empire, when Alexandria was still a major intellectual centre, and the memory of Caesar's war was relatively fresh. Something involving a substantial loss of books had clearly become part of the story. Then comes Plutarch, and Plutarch is the source that turned a harbour fire into the library. Fire everyone remembers. Writing around 150 years after Caesar's campaign, Plutarch says that the fire spread from the docks and destroyed the great library. Just like that. No hesitation, no long explanation. For Plutarch, the link seems direct. Caesar burns the fleet, the fire spreads, and the great collection is lost. If you learned the standard version of this story in school, there is a good chance it came down to you through Plutarch's sentence. But here's the catch. Plutarch was a brilliant biographer and moral writer, not an investigator standing in the smoke of 48 BCE. He was interested in Caesar as a character, in the consequences of ambition and war, in the way one man's decisions could reshape the world, a fire that destroys humanity's greatest collection of knowledge. That's exactly the kind of detail that belongs in a Plutarch biography. It gives Caesar's military decision a tragic scale that stretches far beyond Egypt and Rome. That doesn't make it false. It just means we have to ask what Plutarch knew, where he got it, and whether he was using the great library with the physical precision modern historians want from him. And then the story gets even stranger. A later Roman historian named Cassius Dio says the fire consumed storehouses containing grain and books. Lots of books. Some of the finest books, he says, had been brought there from elsewhere. Notice what he does not say. He does not explicitly say the library itself burned. He points instead toward books stored in warehouses, perhaps commercial shipments, perhaps state-held collections, perhaps scrolls passing through the busiest port in the Mediterranean. That might sound like a technical distinction. It isn't. Imagine a modern city where a fire destroys a warehouse full of rare manuscripts belonging to a national archive. The manuscripts are real. Their loss is catastrophic. But the archive building itself may still be standing across town, its main collection still intact. The archive burned and archive materials burned are not the same claim. Yet, after enough retellings, that distinction can vanish. Cassius Dio may be preserving the memory of exactly that kind of disaster. A huge quantity of books destroyed near the waterfront, linked to Caesar's fire, but not necessarily the entire institution later generations imagined as the Library of Alexandria. And right in the middle of this mystery, remember, the ancient world is not giving us a clean official inventory. No surviving clerk's report says, this many rolls lost, this building damaged, these texts copied elsewhere, these works unrecoverable. What we have are scattered writers, each looking back from a different moment, each with a different reason for mentioning the blaze at all. If you're into mysteries where one missing document can change the entire story, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available through the website link in the description. Because Alexandria may be the ultimate example. The closer you look, the less this feels like one lost library, and more like a crime scene with witnesses who keep contradicting each other. There is another source, written centuries later, that tries to make the distinction even sharper. The Christian historian Orosius says Caesar's fire destroyed 40,000 books, but he places them in buildings near the harbour, not necessarily in the famous library itself. He even suggests these were collections stored for trade or transport. In other words, books were undeniably lost, perhaps in enormous numbers, but the central scholarly institution may not have been the thing that went up in flames. Now Orosius had his own agenda. He was writing in a Christian Roman world and arguing that catastrophes had always happened, even before Christianity. He wasn't composing a neutral history of Alexandria's archives. But his version may preserve a detail the more dramatic story blurred. The city had books everywhere. Books moved through its port. Books sat in storerooms. Books belonged to officials, merchants, teachers, royal administrators, and scholars. A fire did not need to reach one legendary hall to destroy a terrible amount of knowledge. And that is what makes Caesar's fire so hard to pin down. The sources do not give us one answer. They give us layers. Silence from the closest accounts. A philosopher reporting burned books. A biographer declaring the great library destroyed. A historian describing book-filled warehouses. A later writer insisting that the losses were real, but perhaps not what legend claimed. So before we decide whether Caesar destroyed the library, we have to confront an even more basic question. When ancient writers said the library, were they all talking about the same place? Maybe not, because ancient Alexandria did not have one simple, single library map. It had an ecosystem of books, a city built around scholarship, royal power, trade, religion, and administration. And when later writers referred to the library, they may have meant different collections in different places, all connected in memory even if they were separated by streets, walls, or entire districts. The most famous institution was the library associated with the Mausian. The word Mausian is where we get museum, but this was nothing like a modern building full of display cases and tourists. It was a state-supported research community in the royal quarter, the Bruchion. Scholars lived and worked there. They received salaries, meals, and tax exemptions from the Ptolemaic kings. There were lecture spaces, dining halls, gardens, perhaps observatories, and collections of texts. Think less like one room packed with scrolls, and more like an ancient university, research institute, archive, and royal academy, fused into one institution. This was the intellectual machine that made Alexandria famous. It attracted mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, poets, grammarians, geographers, philosophers. Euclid worked in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth there with astonishing accuracy. Aristarchus proposed that the earth moved around the sun, almost 2,000 years before Copernicus. Herophilus performed anatomical research that pushed Greek medicine into new territory. Callimachus created a massive catalogue of the collection, organising authors and works in a system called the Pinaeches. And that last detail matters. The Pinaeches suggests a collection so large that it could not be managed by memory alone. It needed categories, lists, cross-references, scholarly labour. The library was not just a pile of scrolls, it was an attempt to gather, classify, compare, correct, and preserve the intellectual output of the known world. But where exactly was it? The royal quarter stood near the eastern harbour, close to palaces, government buildings, military installations, and the shoreline. Caesar's fire began around the harbour during a desperate military crisis. So on a map, the famous library may have been uncomfortably near the danger. But near is doing a lot of work. We do not have the original floor plan. We do not know the precise boundaries of the Mausion in 48 BCE. We do not know whether its book storage rooms were concentrated in one structure, scattered across a complex, or divided among several buildings. We do not know how fire moved through the waterfront district, what barriers stood in its way, or whether the flames reached the royal quarter at all. Modern Alexandria sits on top of ancient Alexandria. Earthquakes, rising sea levels, rebuilding, warfare, and centuries of urban life have erased or buried much of the physical evidence. Parts of the old royal district now lie beneath the modern city and beneath the sea. Archaeologists have recovered traces of ancient harbour installations and submerged structures, but no surviving sign points to a plaque saying, "The Great Library stood here." So historians are left trying to reconstruct a vanished city from texts, fragments, and probability. The Mausion was the obvious candidate if someone wanted to say Caesar destroyed the Great Library. It was prestigious, it was royal, it was close enough to the conflict zone that a spreading fire is not impossible. And if even part of its holdings were damaged, later writers may have remembered it as the destruction of the library itself. But Alexandria had another major book collection, and this is where the neat version of the story starts to fall apart. Outside the royal quarter, in the southwestern part of the city, stood the Serapeum. This was a huge temple complex dedicated to Serapis, a Greco-Egyptian god created under the Ptolemies to bridge Greek and Egyptian religious traditions. The Serapeum was not some minor shrine. Ancient visitors described it as one of Alexandria's grandest buildings, rising high above the city on an artificial hill, with colonnades, courtyards, statues, and sacred spaces. And somewhere within or alongside that temple complex was another major library collection. Later sources call it the daughter library, as though the Mausion's main library had produced a second branch. That phrase may be accurate. It may also be a later attempt to impose order on a much messier network of collections. But the basic point is hard to escape. Alexandria appears to have had substantial books in the Serapeum, as well as in the royal scholarly complex. This changes the question completely. If Caesar's harbour fire destroyed books, which books were they? If Plutarch says, "the Great Library," did he mean the main collection at the Mausion? Was he using the name broadly for Alexandria's royal book culture? Was he repeating a tradition that had already blended separate collections into one legendary institution? Or had a portion of the main library's holdings been stored elsewhere, perhaps nearer the port, and later generations remembered the loss as the burning of the whole thing? The daughter library at the Serapeum was far less likely to have been reached by a fire starting among ships in the eastern harbour. Not impossible in a city under siege, but much less direct. It stood in another district, away from the immediate waterfront chaos. So if the Serapeum's collection survived Caesar's war, then Alexandria would still have retained a major centre of texts and scholarship even after a terrible loss near the docks. And there may have been more royal archives, temple records, private libraries owned by wealthy Greek and Egyptian families, books held by teachers and philosophers, commercial stocks of copied scrolls waiting to be sold, official documents, land records, tax registers, legal texts. Alexandria was the Mediterranean's book processing centre. Scrolls did not only sit in one sacred hall, they moved. They were copied, they were bought, confiscated, edited, catalogued, loaned, stored, and shipped. The Ptolemies had reportedly been aggressive collectors. Ships entering Alexandria's harbour could be searched for books. Texts found aboard were copied. The originals might be kept for the royal collection, while the owners received copies in return. Whether every detail of that story is true, it captures something real about Ptolemaic ambition. Alexandria wanted to possess knowledge, not just admire it. That means the harbour itself may have been surrounded by book traffic. Warehouses holding imported scrolls would make sense. So would storerooms containing official copies, newly acquired texts, or manuscripts awaiting examination by scholars at the Maution. A waterfront fire could destroy thousands of scrolls without ever entering the institution we picture when we hear the words Library of Alexandria. But then another possibility appears. What if the library was never one fixed body of texts in one fixed building? What if it was a living system, with scrolls constantly circulating between palace collections, scholarly workrooms, copyists, warehouses, and the Serapeum? If that's true, then asking whether Caesar burned the library may be like asking whether a fire destroyed the internet because it burned a data center. The answer depends on what you mean by destroyed. A huge amount can vanish. A vital institution can be wounded, and yet the wider network can keep functioning. Which brings us to the most revealing clue of all, what Alexandria's scholars were still doing after Caesar left. And what they were doing after Caesar left suggests something important. The Maution did not simply vanish from the historical record in 48 BCE. Decades later, the Greek geographer Strabo visited Alexandria and described the Maution as an active institution. He wrote about its shared dining hall, its covered walkways, its scholars, and its priest-like official appointed to lead the community. That does not prove every scroll survived. It does not prove the collection was untouched. But it makes one thing very hard to argue. Caesar's fire did not obviously end Alexandrian scholarship. The city remained a major intellectual centre under Roman rule. Scholars continue to edit texts, teach rhetoric, debate philosophy, practice medicine, observe the stars, and produce new works. Alexandria still mattered because its scholarly machinery was still running. Maybe damaged, maybe diminished, maybe forced to rebuild parts of its collections from copies held elsewhere. But running, and this is where the numbers enter the story, because the numbers attached to Caesar's fire are all over the place. One ancient tradition says 40,000 books were destroyed. Another later tradition gives the almost unbelievable figure of 700,000. 700,000, a number so huge that it has become part of the library's mythic identity. People hear it and imagine 700,000 unique masterpieces, 700,000 irreplaceable works of philosophy, astronomy, medicine, drama, and history going up in one towering inferno. But ancient book numbers are not as simple as they sound. First, what exactly is being counted? A book in the ancient world could mean a scroll, and a long work might take up many scrolls. Homer's Iliad was conventionally divided into 24 books, meaning 24 separate rolls. A single copy of one large historical text could count as dozens of books, so when an ancient author says 40,000 books, they may not mean 40,000 different titles. They may mean 40,000 physical scrolls, and physical scrolls were everywhere. There were duplicate copies, draft copies, damaged copies, commercial copies intended for sale, texts copied for different scholars, official records, imported manuscripts waiting to be processed. If a warehouse near the harbour burned, its contents could be counted in the tens of thousands without representing the entire intellectual inheritance of the Mediterranean. Then there is the problem of ancient numbers themselves. Roman and Greek writers often used large figures to communicate scale, not to provide the kind of audited total a modern archivist would demand. 40,000 may have come from a real estimate. It may have been a rounded figure passed down through retellings. 700,000 may preserve an older claim about the size of Alexandria's total collections at their height. Or it may be a later writer taking the legend of the library's size and attaching it to the moment of Caesar's fire. Think about what happens after a disaster today. One person says thousands were lost. Another says the whole archive is gone. A third says no, the main collection survived, but the storage facility was destroyed. 50 years later, someone combines all three accounts into one clean, horrifying sentence. The archive, containing hundreds of thousands of documents, burned to the ground. That may be emotionally true. It may capture the scale of loss, but historically it can be completely misleading. And there is another issue. We do not have a reliable inventory from the day before the fire. No ancient librarian left us a surviving checklist saying, "Here are the holdings of the Mausian on the morning Caesar arrived. Here are the scrolls stored at the docks. Here is what remained after the flames died." Without that baseline, every estimate becomes a guess, built on another guess. We do not know how many scrolls existed. We do not know how many were copies. We do not know which collections had been moved, and we do not know whether later writers were describing eyewitness information, local tradition, political propaganda, or a story that had grown more dramatic with every retelling. If you like mysteries where the evidence gets stranger, the closer you look, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available through the website, link in the description. Because Alexandria is exactly that kind of mystery. Not a blank space in history, but a crime scene with too many witnesses and no surviving evidence locker. So why do casualty estimates vary wildly? Because different writers may have been counting different things. One may have meant scrolls burned near the harbour. Another may have meant the total number of books supposedly held by Alexandria's libraries. Another may have treated damage to part of the collection as destruction of the entire institution. And later authors, writing centuries after the event, inherited a name so legendary that the Library of Alexandria became larger than any one building, any one archive, or any one fire. The 40,000 figure is possible. The 700,000 figure is possible as a literary claim about Alexandria's immense holdings. But neither can be treated as a precise casualty report. Not without pretending we know far more than we do. What we can say is narrower and in some ways more disturbing. Caesar's fire almost certainly destroyed something valuable. Ancient sources preserve a memory of books lost in the crisis. The harbour was a place where manuscripts, records, and commercial goods could have been concentrated. A large loss is entirely plausible, but the evidence does not let us say, with confidence, that Caesar burned the entire Great Library in 48 BCE. Maybe part of the royal collection was damaged. Maybe thousands of scrolls stored near the port were consumed. Maybe later generations expanded a real disaster into the legend of a total annihilation. Or maybe the fire was only the first wound in a much longer decline, one that unfolded across centuries of war, political upheaval, religious conflict, and institutional collapse. That is the key. The Library of Alexandria was not necessarily destroyed once because Alexandria itself was not destroyed once. It was a living city, and living cities lose knowledge the way coastlines lose land, not always in one spectacular collapse, but through repeated storms, erosion, rebuilding, and neglect. Caesar's flames may have been the first great fire in the story. They were not the last, number 2, Aurelian's 3rd century destruction of the Bruchion. If Caesar's fire was the first great wound in the library's story, this may have been the moment when the ground beneath the library itself was torn apart. Not necessarily by flames, not necessarily in a single dramatic assault, but by urban warfare. The year is around 270 CE. More than 3 centuries have passed since Caesar fought in Alexandria. Rome is no longer the confident Mediterranean superpower it once was. It is still enormous, still rich, still dangerous. But it is coming apart at the seams. Emperors are being made and murdered with terrifying speed. Armies are declaring their own commanders emperor. Germanic groups are pressing into the western provinces. Persia is attacking in the east. Plague, inflation, civil war and political chaos are hammering the empire from every direction at once. Historians call this period the crisis of the 3rd century, and that name almost sounds too mild. Imagine an empire so unstable that in the space of about 50 years it goes through emperor after emperor, many dying violently, some ruling only months. Provinces begin acting independently because Rome seems too weak or too distant to protect them. Local commanders raise armies, regional elites make their own deals. The Roman world does not collapse completely, but for a while it looks like it might. And out of that chaos comes one of the most extraordinary women in ancient history. Zenobia. She was the queen of Palmyra, a wealthy oasis city in what is now Syria. Palmyra sat on the trade routes linking the Roman world to Mesopotamia, Persia, and lands farther east. Caravans moved through its desert streets carrying silk, spices, precious stones, ivory, perfumes, and goods from places most Romans would never see. It was rich, strategically vital, and, during Rome's crisis, increasingly powerful. Zenobia's husband, Odaenathus, had been Rome's ally in the east. When the Persian king Shapur captured the Roman emperor Valerian in 260 CE, an event so humiliating it was almost unimaginable, Odaenathus stepped in. He fought the Persians, defended Roman territory, and became the most powerful man in the eastern half of the empire without technically calling himself emperor. Then Odaenathus was assassinated. His young son, Vabalathus, inherited the title. But everyone knew who was actually ruling: Zenobia. Ancient writers describe her as ambitious, educated, disciplined, and fiercely intelligent. Some later stories say she spoke multiple languages, rode horseback with her troops, and claimed descent from Cleopatra. We should be cautious with those details. Ancient historians loved turning powerful women into legends, especially women who challenged Rome. But even through the exaggeration, one fact is impossible to miss. Zenobia built a kingdom powerful enough to make Rome afraid. At first, she did not openly declare war. That is what makes the story so interesting. Palmyra operated in the grey zone between alliance and independence. Coins were issued in the names of both the Roman emperor and Zenobia's son. Official titles remained carefully ambiguous. It was as if Palmyra was saying, yes, Rome still rules here, while quietly taking control of province after province. Then Zenobia reached for Egypt, and Egypt was not just another province. Egypt fed Rome. Its grain shipments were essential to the capital's survival. Control the Nile Valley, control one of the empire's greatest sources of food, tax revenue, and strategic power. Alexandria, at the mouth of that system, was one of the largest cities in the world, a metropolis of merchants, sailors, soldiers, priests, philosophers, bureaucrats, craftsmen, and scholars. It was also a city with a long memory of independence, factional violence, and imperial power struggles. In about 270 or 271 CE, Palmyrene forces entered Egypt. The details are frustratingly unclear. Our sources are scattered, late, and sometimes contradictory. One tradition says Zenobia's general, Zabdus, conquered the province. Another hints at fighting involving a Roman official named Timagenes. There may have been multiple campaigns, temporary reversals, and competing claims of victory. Ancient political reporting was not exactly neutral. Every side had reasons to make itself look stronger than it was. But the basic outline is hard to escape. For a time, Egypt was pulled out of Rome's orbit and into Zenobia's growing Eastern Empire. Think about the scale of that move. A queen in Palmyra ruling through her young son had taken control of Syria, much of Asia Minor, and Egypt. Her territory stretched across enormous distances. Her armies had defeated or displaced Roman officials. Her coinage was circulating. Her government was operating. Rome had not merely lost a city, it had lost an entire eastern power bloc. And then Aurelian arrived. Aurelian was exactly the kind of emperor a collapsing empire produces. A career soldier, hard, relentless, and apparently impossible to intimidate. He had risen through the ranks of the Roman army during the worst years of the crisis. By the time he became emperor in 270 CE, Rome was divided into three major pieces. A breakaway empire controlled Britain, Gaul, and parts of Spain in the west. Zenobia's Palmyrene regime held much of the east, and Aurelian controlled the battered centre. His mission was brutally simple: put the empire back together. He moved first against enemies on Rome's northern frontiers, driving back invading forces and restoring control over vulnerable regions. Then he turned east. In 272 CE, Aurelian marched towards Zenobia's territory. His army met Palmyrene forces near Imae, not far from Antioch. Zenobia's famous heavy cavalry, armoured cataphracts, were formidable, but Aurelian outmanoeuvred them. He won again at Emesa. Zenobia retreated to Palmyra. Aurelian besieged the city. At some point she attempted to escape eastward, possibly seeking Persian support. Roman forces captured her before she could get away. It sounds like the end of the revolt. It wasn't, because conquering a kingdom on paper is one thing. Reclaiming every city, every province, every army, every local elite that had backed it is something else entirely. Egypt had been part of Zenobia's empire. Alexandria had lived through the upheaval, and when Roman authority came roaring back, the consequences for the city may have been catastrophic, especially in the old royal quarter, the Bruchion. The Bruchion was not just a neighbourhood, it was the nerve centre of Ptolemaic Alexandria, the part of the city where power had been concentrated for centuries. Alexandria had been founded by Alexander the Great, but it was his successors, the Ptolemies, who turned it into one of the great cities of the ancient world. They built a royal district along the northeastern waterfront, close to the harbours, close to the sea lanes, close to everything that made Egypt rich and dangerous. And the Bruchion was at the heart of it. Picture a vast urban zone of palaces, gardens, administrative buildings, military installations, shrines, treasuries, and elite residences. The Ptolemies did not rule Egypt from some remote fortress upriver. They ruled from here, in a waterfront complex built to project wealth, order, and absolute control. From the Bruchion, kings could watch ships entering the harbour. They could receive ambassadors from Greece, Rome, Nubia, Judea, and beyond. They could manage grain exports flowing from the Nile into the Mediterranean. They could control the city's garrison, supervise officials, store state records, and make sure that the enormous wealth of Egypt moved in the right direction, which usually meant toward them. This mattered because Alexandria was not merely a city in Egypt. It was Egypt's gateway to the wider world. The Nile produced grain on a scale that helped feed Mediterranean populations. Egyptian taxes funded armies and imperial ambitions. Goods from Africa, Arabia, India, and the eastern deserts passed through its markets. Whoever controlled Alexandria had access to one of the most valuable machines of wealth creation in the ancient world, and whoever controlled the Bruchion had their hands on the controls. Its location made it especially important in a crisis. The royal quarter stood near the eastern harbour, an area connected to naval power, commercial traffic, and the city's most prestigious institutions. A commander holding that waterfront could bring in supplies, move troops quickly, communicate with ships offshore, and keep an eye on the routes through which an enemy might arrive. In ancient warfare, geography was never background scenery. It decided who ate, who got reinforcements, who could escape, and who got trapped. Alexandria itself was built around movement. Broad streets cut across the city in a grid. The Great Canopic Way ran east to west, linking major districts. The Heptastadion, a long causeway, connected the mainland to the island of Pharos, dividing the coastline into harbours. One side served more directly commercial traffic, another offered shelter for military and royal vessels. Warehouses, docks, customs officials, sailors and merchants crowded the waterfront. But the Bruchion was different. It was where wealth became authority. A grain ship could arrive at Alexandria, but someone had to tax it, protect it, record it, redirect it, and decide where its cargo went. A foreign embassy could enter the city with gifts and promises, but someone had to receive them. A rebellion could begin in a market square or among a military unit, but the response would be organized from the places where officials, soldiers, and imperial resources were concentrated. That was the royal quarter, and then there was the prestige factor. Ancient rulers understood something modern governments still understand very well. Power needs buildings. It needs monuments, ceremonies, guarded gates, controlled access, and spaces designed to make ordinary people feel the distance between themselves and the people in charge. The Ptolemaic rulers made the Bruchion into exactly that kind of place. It was a city within the city, a royal landscape. The physical statement that Egypt was governed by a dynasty descended, or at least claiming descent, from Alexander's world-conquering empire. Even after the Romans took Egypt in 30 BCE, after Cleopatra's death, and the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the quarter did not suddenly become irrelevant. Rome had inherited the machinery of Egyptian rule. Emperors understood that Alexandria was too important to neglect and too volatile to trust completely. So the royal district remained strategically valuable. Its buildings, institutions, storehouses, docks, and official spaces were part of the infrastructure through which Rome governed the province. And somewhere within or near this elite intellectual and administrative landscape stood the Mausion, traditionally associated with the famous Library of Alexandria. That association is crucial, not because we can point to a surviving foundation stone and say, here's the exact reading room where every scroll sat. We cannot. The archaeology of ancient Alexandria is brutally difficult. Much of the ancient shoreline has changed. Parts of the old city are underwater. Centuries of construction, earthquakes, subsidence, reuse, and destruction have scrambled the map. But ancient writers consistently connect the Mausion with the palace district. The institution was not imagined as an isolated building full of books. It was part of a royal system, a community of scholars supported by the state, located in the orbit of royal patronage, embedded in the same district where political power, wealth, and military security were concentrated. That arrangement made sense when the Ptolemies were strong. Knowledge was prestige. Scholars made the dynasty look civilized, learned, Greek, cosmopolitan. A king who could gather poets, mathematicians, physicians, geographers, and editors from across the Mediterranean was doing more than funding research. He was advertising that his court stood at the centre of the intellectual world. But that same arrangement created a terrifying vulnerability. Put your greatest cultural institution inside the most strategically valuable district in a city, and you have tied scholarship to the fate of power. If the royal quarter is secure, the scholars are protected. If the royal quarter becomes a battlefield, the scholars, archives, collections, and buildings around them are suddenly standing in the blast zone. It is the ancient version of putting a national library inside a military headquarters, a treasury, and a presidential compound all at once. And if you enjoy mysteries where the evidence is fragmentary, the stakes are enormous, and every answer creates 2 more questions. There's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available through the website, link in the description. Because this is where Alexandria's story becomes less like a simple tale of a library burning, and more like a forensic investigation into a vanished city. By Aurelian's time, the Bruchion was still valuable for all the reasons it had always been valuable. It sat near the sea. It was connected to authority. It carried the memory of monarchy and empire. It was a place an occupying force would want to hold, and a returning Roman regime would want to secure, which means that when control of Alexandria became contested, this was not some quiet residential district safely removed from the violence. This was exactly the kind of place armies would fight over, and that is exactly what at least one important ancient source says happened. The clearest surviving statement comes from Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian writing in the late 4th century, roughly a century after Aurelian's Egyptian campaign. Describing Alexandria, Ammianus pauses to mention the Bruchion, and he says that this district, once the home of many distinguished people, was destroyed during civil conflicts in the time of Aurelian. That sentence is short, almost casually short, but it is one of the most important sentences in the entire Library of Alexandria mystery, because Ammianus was not describing some remote village or minor suburb. He was describing the Bruchion, the royal quarter, the same elite district ancient writers connect with the palace complex and the Mausion. If his statement is even broadly accurate, then the part of Alexandria most closely associated with the old scholarly institution suffered a major catastrophe in the 3rd century. Not necessarily one single fire, not necessarily every building flattened on the same day, not necessarily a perfectly targeted act of cultural destruction, but devastation, and the word matters. Ammianus does not say the Bruchion was damaged. He does not say it was captured, occupied, or disturbed. He says it was destroyed. For a writer with no obvious reason to dramatize the fate of an old royal neighborhood, that is a remarkable claim. Now, we need to be careful. Ancient historians could use broad language. Destroyed might mean burned out streets, ruined palaces, abandoned compounds, collapsed public buildings, or a district so badly damaged that it never recovered its former status. It does not automatically mean every structure from the waterfront to the city centre vanished completely. Ancient cities were not cleanly erased. They were broken apart in layers. A palace burns, but an outbuilding survives. A temple is looted, but its walls remain standing. One street becomes rubble while another fills with refugees. Soldiers strip timber, bronze, stone, and roof tiles from damaged buildings. Years later, survivors rebuild a few rooms inside a much larger ruin. Then later generations quarry the ruins again. By the time a historian writes that a district was destroyed, he may be describing the loss of a functioning urban world, not the literal disappearance of every brick, but that may be even more significant. The Bruchion had once been a living system. Palaces, official residences, gardens, archives, shrines, administrative offices, docks, storerooms, barracks, intellectual institutions. Its importance did not depend on any one building. It depended on all of those parts working together. Once that system breaks down, the royal quarter can survive physically while dying institutionally. Think of a modern capital district after a civil war. The ministries may still be there, the roads may still exist. A few government buildings may still have roofs, but the records are scattered, staff have fled, funding has stopped, security is gone, and nobody knows who has authority anymore. From the outside it is still a neighbourhood. From the inside it is a corpse. That is what Ammianus may be preserving for us. Not simply a memory of flames, but a memory that the Bruchion ceased to be the place it had been. and other clues point in the same direction, though none are as direct. Earlier writers describe Alexandria's royal zone as a vast and prestigious complex. Strabo, writing in the early Roman period, had seen a city where the palace district occupied an enormous stretch of the waterfront. It was a place of royal monuments, institutions, and controlled access. But later descriptions of Alexandria do not speak of the Bruchion with the same confidence or prominence. That silence is not proof by itself. Silence almost never is. Ancient authors omit things for all kinds of reasons. They focus on churches, riots, emperors, temples, saints, grain ships, or philosophical feuds. They do not write city guides for future archaeologists trying to solve a 2,000-year-old mystery. Still, when a district once famous enough to be identified as the residence of distinguished people starts fading from the written record after a reported destruction, it is hard not to notice. The physical evidence is even more frustrating. Much of ancient Alexandria is difficult or impossible to excavate in the ordinary sense. The coastline changed. Portions of the old royal waterfront now lie beneath modern development or underwater. Earthquakes and subsidence altered the harbour zone. Builders reused ancient stone for centuries. Later cities grew over earlier cities, turning the archaeological record into something like a manuscript written, scraped clean, and written over again. So we do not have a neat ash layer labelled, Aurelian was here. What we have is a city whose most vulnerable historical district was caught in a violent imperial crisis, a later historian who says that district was destroyed, and a long-term urban memory in which the old royal quarter no longer appears as the dominating centre it once was. That is not certainty, but it is not nothing either. And once you accept that the Bruchion may have been shattered in Aurelian's time, the question becomes much more uncomfortable, because the Mausian was not just a name on a map. It was people, rooms, collections, salaries, patronage, routines and protection. If the district around it was wrecked, what exactly could have survived? That is the question historians cannot answer cleanly, not because it is unimportant, but because the evidence becomes almost painfully thin. Did the Mausian still function after Aurelian's war? The honest answer is possibly, but if it did, it probably did not function in the way people imagine when they picture the great Library of Alexandria at its height. By the 3rd century, the Mausian was already ancient. It had been founded under the Ptolemies, sustained by royal money, populated by scholars who received salaries and meals, and tied to the prestige of a Greek-speaking dynasty that had been gone for nearly 300 years. Rome had inherited Alexandria, but Rome did not necessarily preserve every Ptolemaic institution intact. Empires are very good at keeping useful systems alive. They are less reliable at maintaining expensive traditions, simply because they are old. And the Mausian was expensive. It needed buildings, staff, teachers, copyists, curators, administrators. It needed people capable of reading and preserving Greek texts. It needed patrons willing to pay for scholarship that did not always produce immediate military or financial returns. Most of all, it needed stability. The 3rd century gave Alexandria almost none of that. Civil wars, disputed emperors, economic disruption, foreign invasions, plague, inflation, and local rebellions had battered the Roman world for decades. Alexandria remained important because Egypt fed the empire, but being important could make a city more vulnerable, not less. Every rival wanted control of its grain, its harbour, its taxes, and its population. In that kind of world, a scholarly institution was not necessarily destroyed because someone hated books. It could simply be starved of the conditions books need to survive. Think about what a library really is, not shelves, not scrolls, not a famous building with a marble inscription. A library is a machine for making knowledge continue. Someone has to acquire texts, someone has to copy damaged manuscripts before they fall apart, someone has to organize them so readers can find them. Someone has to train new scholars when the old ones die. Someone has to pay for oil lamps, writing materials, rooms, food, and security. Remove enough of those people, and even an untouched collection begins to vanish. A scroll does not need a bonfire to die, it just needs neglect. Papyrus is organic. It tears. It moulds. It gets eaten by insects. Ink fades. Glue fails. A manuscript copied for the last time in 260 can be gone by 360 if nobody makes another copy. And if a library staff scatter during a siege, they may carry some texts away, leave others behind, or lose track of what was stored where. The collection becomes not one great treasure, but thousands of fragile objects moving through chaos. Now, there are hints that some form of the Mausian endured. Later sources still use the word Mausian in connection with Alexandria. The most intriguing clue involves Theon of Alexandria, the mathematician and astronomer who lived in the late 4th century. In a manuscript tradition, Theon is described as the man of the Mausian. That phrase has caused enormous debate. Does it mean he literally worked at the old institution? Was he a teacher in a surviving scholarly establishment? Was the Mausian still operating, perhaps in reduced form, perhaps in a different location, perhaps as a title that outlived the original building? Or was Mausian becoming a looser word, something closer to an academy, a learned circle, or simply a remembered institutional name? We do not know, but notice what that uncertainty tells us. If the Mausian had survived in a strong, continuous, publicly visible form, we would expect clearer evidence. Lists of directors, official records, descriptions of its buildings, accounts of its collections. Instead, we get a shadowy title attached to one scholar more than a century after Aurelian. That is not proof of extinction, but it is not proof of health either. And this is where the famous library story becomes much more complicated than the simple version. Maybe the original library attached to the Mausian had already been diminished long before Aurelian. Maybe Caesar's fire had damaged part of the book trade or harbour storage centuries earlier. Maybe Roman administrators had reduced funding. Maybe collections had been dispersed into private hands, schools, temples, and smaller libraries. Maybe the Serapeum had become the more visible home of Alexandria's remaining books. Or maybe the Mausian rebuilt after every disaster. Smaller each time, more fragile each time, like a city after repeated earthquakes. For anyone fascinated by mysteries where the evidence refuses to line up neatly, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available through the website link in the description. And Alexandria belongs near the top of that list, because every answer seems to open another question. What we can say is that Aurelian's campaign may have been a breaking point. Not necessarily the moment every Alexandrian manuscript went up in flames. Not necessarily the instant the last scholar walked out of the Mausian, carrying the last scroll. History almost never gives us endings that clean. But the destruction of the Bruchion could have severed the Mausian from the environment that made it possible, the palatial district, the old institutional networks, the wealthy patrons, the protected spaces, the prestige of being embedded in Alexandria's royal heart. A surviving school is not the same thing as a surviving library. A surviving title is not the same thing as a surviving institution. And a surviving institution is not the same thing as a surviving collection. By the time later generations looked back, they may have remembered the Mausian because its name was too famous to disappear. But the actual place, the working scholarly world behind that name, may already have been reduced beyond recognition. So Aurelian's war does not solve the mystery of the Library of Alexandria. it changes the mystery. Instead of asking, who burned it, we have to ask something harder. How many times can an institution be damaged, dispersed, rebuilt, diminished, and renamed before it is fair to say that it is gone? And if the Mausians' old world was already broken in the 3rd century, then the next destruction on the timeline becomes even more important. Because Alexandria still had another great repository of learning, the Serapeum. Number 3, the Serapeum's demolition in 391 CE. If the Mausian was the intellectual symbol of old Alexandria, the Serapeum was something even more visible. It stood on the city's high ground, a vast sanctuary dedicated to Serapis, the Greco-Egyptian god created under the Ptolemies to bridge 2 worlds, Greek and Egyptian, imported rulers and local traditions, philosophy and ritual, empire and religion. And by the late 4th century, that kind of bridge had become dangerous, because Alexandria was no longer just a city of competing schools and ancient temples. It was becoming a battlefield over what the Roman world was allowed to believe. For centuries, Christians in Alexandria had lived alongside followers of the older cults. There were temples, processions, sacrifices, philosophical debates, arguments in marketplaces, insults shouted across streets. Sometimes there was coexistence, sometimes there was violence. But the balance was changing fast. Christianity had gone from a persecuted religion to an imperial religion with astonishing speed. In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine legalized Christian worship. By the end of the century, under Emperor Theodosius of the First, imperial policy had moved much further. Traditional public cults, especially sacrifice, were increasingly restricted. The old gods had not vanished overnight. Millions of people still honoured them. Temples still stood. Priests still performed rituals. Educated elites still read Homer, Plato, and the ancient philosophers. But the political weather had changed, and when political weather changes, buildings that stood safely for centuries can suddenly look like targets. The man at the centre of Alexandria's storm was Theophilus, the city's bishop. Theophilus was not a distant theologian writing polite letters from a quiet study. He was a powerful public figure in one of the Roman Empire's most volatile cities. Alexandria had grain, wealth, shipping, rival ethnic communities, enormous crowds, and a long tradition of street politics. A religious dispute here was never just an argument about doctrine. It could become a confrontation involving monks, city officials, temple supporters and mobs, armed with whatever they could find. And Theophilus understood power. Ancient accounts, especially Christian accounts written after the conflict, portray him as aggressive in dismantling pagan institutions. The exact details are difficult to separate from propaganda. Our best surviving narratives were written by people with strong loyalties, strong enemies, and very little interest in making the other side look reasonable. But the broad outline is hard to escape. By around 391 CE, the confrontation between Alexandria's Christians and supporters of the traditional cults had reached a breaking point. It may have begun with an apparently smaller dispute. Theophilus reportedly obtained permission to convert or dismantle a disused pagan sanctuary. During the work, objects associated with older religious rites were displayed publicly, perhaps mockingly. Christian writers describe these items as obscene evidence of pagan superstition. Pagan supporters would almost certainly have seen the act differently, not as reform, but humiliation. Picture what that means in a city already on edge. For Christians, the old temples could represent idolatry, cruelty, false gods, and a world that had persecuted their faith. For pagans, those same temples were not just buildings. They were ancestral memory, civic identity, sacred spaces where generations had prayed, mourned, celebrated, and tried to make sense of death, harvests, illness, and fate. destroy a temple, and you are not merely removing stone. You are announcing that one version of reality has defeated another. The reaction was violent. According to the ancient historian Socrates Scholasticus, supporters of the traditional cults seized the Serapeum and used it as a stronghold. Some Christians were captured. There were reports of torture and killings. The details may be shaped by the author's perspective, but there is little doubt that Alexandria entered a period of open religious conflict, and the Serapeum was the perfect place for a last stand. It was not an obscure shrine hidden in a side street. It was one of the grandest sanctuaries in the entire Mediterranean world. Ancient visitors described monumental stairways, colonnades, sacred chambers, and the enormous cult statue of Serapis. The god himself had represented Alexandria's old religious order for nearly 600 years. Serapis was designed to be universal. He had Egyptian associations, but he looked Greek. He was linked with healing, fertility, the underworld, royal authority, and divine protection. His temple was a statement that Alexandria was not merely a Roman city or a Greek city or an Egyptian city. It was its own civilization, which is exactly why it could not easily survive the new order. Theophilus appealed to imperial authority. Emperor Theodosius issued a response that seems almost calculated to make a symbolic point. Those who had committed violence were to be pardoned, but the temples connected to the conflict were to be destroyed. Think about that for a second. The men inside the Serapeum could be forgiven. Serapis could not. That distinction mattered. It transformed the conflict from a riot with religious overtones into a public declaration of imperial power. The state was not simply restoring order between two angry communities. It was deciding which sacred landscape Alexandria would inherit. And once that decision arrived, the fate of the Serapeum was no longer in the hands of its defenders. It was in the hands of Theophilus, the imperial authorities, and the crowds gathering below its walls. And this is where the story of the Library of Alexandria becomes almost impossible to separate from the story of the Serapeum. Because the Serapeum may not have been only a temple, it may also have been a library, or more precisely, it may have housed what ancient writers later described as a daughter library, a secondary collection connected in some way to the larger scholarly institution associated with the Mausian and the old royal quarter. That possibility is why the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE has become one of the most powerful candidates for the final burning of the Library of Alexandria. But there is a problem. The evidence is real. It is also frustratingly vague. No surviving ancient source gives us a neat inventory from the year 391. Nobody says here are the titles stored in the Serapeum on the day it was demolished. Nobody tells us how many scrolls remained, which languages they were written in, whether they belonged to a functioning scholarly collection, or whether they had already been moved, dispersed, sold, copied, damaged, or simply allowed to rot. And that matters, because an ancient library was not one permanent frozen thing. Scrolls moved, collections were divided, books were copied and sent elsewhere. Private scholars built their own libraries, teachers carried texts from city to city, wealthy patrons donated books, wars scattered them. Fires destroyed some, neglect destroyed others. A library could decline for centuries before anyone finally knocked down the building associated with it. So when people say the Library of Alexandria was destroyed in 391, what they often mean is something more specific and much less certain. They mean the Serapeum, a place that may once have contained a major book collection, was destroyed in 391. That is not quite the same claim. The idea of a daughter library comes from late ancient traditions that describe Alexandria as having two great collections. The famous main library was associated with the royal district, the Bruchion, near the Mausian. Then there was another collection, supposedly housed at the Serapeum. One ancient Christian writer, Epiphanius, gave striking numbers. He claimed the main library held 400,000 books, while the collection at the Serapeum held another 42,800. Those numbers are repeated constantly because they sound wonderfully precise. 400,000 here, 42,800 there. It feels like someone counted every scroll, but ancient numbers can be deceptive. Were these individual works, separate scrolls, duplicate copies? Catalogue entries, volumes containing several texts? Numbers rounded upward to make Alexandria sound magnificent. Numbers passed down through centuries of retelling until nobody remembered where they came from. We do not know, and Epiphanius was writing long after the Ptolemaic Golden Age. He was not standing in the Serapeum during its heyday, checking shelves with a clipboard. He was preserving a tradition about what Alexandria had once possessed. Still, the tradition did not come from nowhere. The Serapeum was enormous, wealthy, prestigious, and closely tied to the cultural life of the city. It had space, it had status, it had educated visitors, priests, administrators, and connections to the wider world of Greek learning. A substantial collection of books there is entirely plausible. In fact, to an ancient visitor, the idea might not have seemed surprising at all. Major temples were not just places of worship. They could be archives, treasuries, schools, meeting places, centres of administration, and repositories of written knowledge. In a world before public universities, national libraries, and government record offices as we know them, sacred institutions often stored information because they were among the most permanent and well-funded places in a city. A temple could protect a text, at least until the temple itself became the target. There is another important clue. The 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing before the destruction of the Serapeum, described the sanctuary as famous for its magnificent structures and referred to libraries there in language that suggests Alexandria's intellectual prestige was still remembered through that place. Notice the word libraries, plural. That does not prove the Serapeum held the surviving core of the Great Library, but it does suggest that book collections, perhaps multiple collections, were associated with the sanctuary at some point in late antiquity. And this is where the timeline gets unsettling. The royal quarter had already suffered terribly during the wars of the 3rd century. The old Bruchion, where the Mausian and main library had traditionally stood, may have been devastated generations before Theophilus ever entered the picture. If that happened, the Serapeum's collection may have become more important simply because it survived longer. Imagine Alexandria's scholarship as a great river splitting into channels. One channel ran through the Mausian and royal quarter. Another may have flowed uphill to the Serapeum. Over centuries, drought, war, political change, and neglect narrowed both channels. By 391, maybe the Serapeum still held a meaningful reserve of old learning. Or maybe it held only the memory of one. That difference is everything. And before we go further, if you like historical mysteries where the evidence refuses to behave, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available through the website link in the description. Because Alexandria is only one example of how history can leave us clues, ruins, rumours, and just enough missing information to drive researchers completely insane. Now, there is a temptation to picture the Serapeum as a giant ancient version of a modern library. Endless shelves, scholars rushing to rescue armfuls of books. Thousands of irreplaceable texts going up in flames as the temple falls. It is possible that texts were lost there, but the honest answer is that we cannot reconstruct that scene. The Serapeum may have held a large daughter library in its earlier centuries. It may have held a reduced collection by 391. It may have preserved archives, religious texts, philosophical works, and copies of classical literature. Or its books may already have been scattered across Alexandria long before the final confrontation. What we can say is that the Serapeum was one of the last places in Alexandria where the old library tradition could plausibly still have had a physical home. And that made what happened next far more than the destruction of a temple. And the ground beneath modern Alexandria gives us part of the answer. Not all of it, not even close, but enough to show that the Serapeum was not some minor shrine on the edge of town, later inflated by legend. It was one of the most imposing sacred complexes in the eastern Mediterranean. It stood on the high ground of the ancient city, on the hill now associated with Kom el Shukafa and the famous column usually called Pompey's Pillar. From there, the sanctuary would have looked down across Alexandria's streets, harbour districts, warehouses, baths, markets and crowded neighbourhoods. This was a place built to dominate the skyline. Ancient writers described broad approaches, monumental stairways, courtyards, colonnades and richly decorated buildings. Much of that visible grandeur is gone now. Alexandria has been rebuilt, quarried, flooded, bombarded and expanded over nearly 2,000 years. Stone blocks from ancient monuments were reused in later walls, houses, churches, mosques and fortifications. Whole sections of the old city are beneath modern streets or underwater. But the surviving archaeology still has a strange power. The great granite column remains, rising nearly 27 metres above the ground. It is not actually connected to Pompeii. It was probably erected in honour of the Emperor Diocletian around the end of the 3rd century. But its location tells us something crucial. This was a ceremonial landscape of imperial scale, a place where religion, civic prestige and political authority all met. Near it, excavations have revealed remains associated with the Serapeum complex, foundations, walls, underground spaces, water installations and fragments of architecture that hint at an institution far larger than the ruins visible today. And then there are the tunnels. Beneath the sanctuary area, archaeologists found a network of subterranean passages and chambers. Some of these spaces were lined with niches. Others appear to have been part of elaborate water systems, possibly connected to sacred rituals surrounding the god Serapis. Ancient religion was rarely simple. A temple did not just contain a statue and an altar. It could involve processions, storage rooms, priestly quarters, hidden ritual spaces, wells, cisterns, workshops, archives and rooms whose purpose is now impossible to recover. The underground galleries at the Serapeum have inspired plenty of dramatic claims. People have called them secret library vaults, hidden repositories of forbidden scrolls, underground chambers where priests preserved the lost science of Egypt and Greece. That makes for a great story. The archaeology is less cooperative. Niches in a wall can hold scroll containers. They can also hold lamps, votive objects, funerary material, ritual equipment or statues. A chamber beneath a temple can be a storeroom. It can be a water channel. It can be part of a sacred theatrical experience, designed to make worshippers feel they were entering the underworld. Without inscriptions saying, "Library storage, this way," archaeologists have to work with probabilities. And probabilities are not the same as proof. What the site clearly shows is wealth, complexity, and longevity. The Serapeum was remodelled repeatedly over centuries. It did not exist in one fixed form from the Ptolemies to 391. Buildings were added, spaces changed function, older structures were buried beneath newer ones. A room used for administration in one century might become storage in another. A storage space might later be filled with rubble after a renovation. By the time the sanctuary was destroyed, its physical layout may have been very different from what it had been during Alexandria's intellectual peak. That is one reason the library question remains so difficult. If a large collection had been housed there in the early Roman period, where would its rooms be now? The honest answer is that they may have been destroyed. They may be under modern construction, they may have been stripped for building stone, or they may never have been a distinct library building in the modern sense. Books could have been kept in several rooms, in administrative offices, in priestly residences, in attached schools, or in wooden cabinets that left little trace once the walls came down. Papyrus creates another problem. Papyrus can survive for thousands of years in the dry sands of Egypt. That is why Egypt has given us astonishing caches of ancient documents. Tax receipts, private letters, contracts, magical spells, school exercises, poetry, fragments of lost plays, even grocery lists. But Alexandria is not the desert. It is a humid coastal city. Papyrus exposed to moisture, insects, fire, disturbance, and centuries of rebuilding does not last kindly. If books from the Serapeum were thrown into wet rubble, carried away, burned, reused, or simply left exposed, the odds of finding a neat archaeological layer labelled the final library become very small. That absence is frustrating, but it is also meaningful. We have no excavated room filled with carbonized scrolls like the famous library at Herculaneum, no surviving catalogue from the sanctuary, no cache of papyri that can be confidently identified as the books of the Serapeum in 391. No physical evidence that lets us count losses, name titles, or point to a shelf and say, this is where Alexandria's final treasures stood. Instead, the site gives us a more unsettling picture. A vast sanctuary, a prestigious institution, underground chambers whose exact use remains uncertain. Architecture repeatedly damaged, rebuilt, and erased. A place that absolutely had the resources to house written collections, but has not yielded the kind of evidence needed to prove what survived inside it at the end. And that forces us to ask a different question. If archaeology cannot show us the books, can the surviving written accounts of the destruction tell us what happened to the people who used the Serapeum, maintained it, and gave its spaces their meaning? The written accounts can tell us that the Serapeum was attacked, occupied, stripped, and transformed. They can tell us that a religious world ended there. They can tell us that sacred images were broken, that the cult of Serapis lost one of its greatest homes, and that a building which had stood for centuries was no longer allowed to mean what it once meant. But they cannot give us the one thing everyone wants: an inventory. No surviving witness steps into the Serapeum in 391 and says, "Here are the shelves. Here are the titles on them. Here are the works of Aristotle, Euclid, Sophocles, Egyptian priestly records, astronomical tables, medical treatises, and histories that will now be destroyed." That silence matters, because a demolished room with shelves, niches, cupboards, or storage cabinets does not automatically mean that every text once associated with that room vanished on the same day. It is tempting to imagine an ancient library as a sealed time capsule, a building full of books intact for centuries, waiting for one terrible moment when fire or violence erases everything at once. Real libraries do not work like that. They are moving systems. Books are borrowed, copied, sold, stolen, sent to teachers, carried by students, inherited by families, taken by officials, moved during repairs, deposited in temples, stored in private houses, used until they wear out, then recopied or discarded. A text in Alexandria might have another copy in Rome, Antioch, Athens, Constantinople, Caesarea, Pergamon, or some private scholar's chest halfway across the Mediterranean. And papyrus itself practically forces this kind of movement. A scroll was not an immortal object. It could tear, rot, become worm-eaten, or simply fall apart after generations of handling. If a work mattered, scribes copied it, then somebody copied the copy. The survival of ancient literature has always depended less on one original shelf than on a chain of people deciding again and again that a particular text was worth preserving. That chain could break anywhere. A book can be lost without flames. A work can disappear because nobody copies it for 200 years, because the language becomes unfashionable, because a school closes, because a new generation decides the subject is useless, dangerous, pagan, embarrassing, or just boring. Whole libraries can survive while thousands of texts inside them slowly die through neglect. And the reverse is also true. A library can be destroyed while many of its books survive somewhere else. Think about what the destruction of a library really means. It can mean the destruction of a building. It can mean the destruction of furniture, catalogues, storage rooms, and the institutional staff who maintained the collection. It can mean the loss of access. A scholar who once walked into a reading room and requested a text may suddenly find the doors closed, the patrons gone, the librarians dispersed, and the entire system that made research possible dismantled. That is devastating, even if every scroll was not burned. In some ways it may be more devastating, because knowledge is not just ink on papyrus. Knowledge needs readers, teachers, copyists, money for materials, safe places to work, networks that connect one scholar to another. If those conditions disappear, surviving books become isolated objects. They may sit in a chest for decades unread, then the owner dies. The heirs do not know what they are. The scrolls are sold by weight, used as wrapping, cut apart or left to decay. The shelves do not have to burn for the intellectual world behind them to collapse. And before we go further, if you enjoy mysteries where the evidence is real but the answers are still frustratingly incomplete, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available through the website link in the description. Because the Serapeum is exactly that kind of mystery. Not a blank space, a space crowded with clues that refuse to line up into one clean story. The later tradition of a final, total library destruction is powerful because it gives us a simple ending. One mob, one building, one catastrophe. The last light of ancient knowledge going out in a single night. But history is usually crueler and messier than that. By 391, Alexandria's old intellectual institutions had already been changing for centuries. The original royal library, whatever remained of it, had long ceased to be the unquestioned centre of learning it had been under the Ptolemies. Books had travelled, scholars had moved, collections had been scattered across the Roman world. Some works were copied into codices, the early book form made of bound pages rather than scrolls. Others were translated, excerpted, quoted, summarized, or absorbed into later writings. Some were almost certainly lost. The problem is that we cannot confidently assign those losses to the demolition of the Serapeum. Maybe texts vanished there. Maybe a local collection was destroyed or dispersed. Maybe shelves were emptied before the final attack. Maybe books were carried away by people trying to save them. Maybe the sanctuary had little more than religious and administrative texts by that point. Maybe it still held a significant collection, but one that had already been copied elsewhere. The evidence does not let us choose confidently between these possibilities. So the honest conclusion is not that nothing was lost. Something was lost. A monumental sanctuary was destroyed. A community's sacred centre was dismantled. Cultural continuity was broken. Documents, objects, records, and books may well have disappeared in the chaos. But destroyed shelves are not a census of destroyed knowledge. They prove that a place was ruined. They do not prove which texts were inside. They do not prove that those texts existed nowhere else. And they do not prove that Alexandria's intellectual life ended with the falling of the Serapeum. That ending would come more slowly, not with one final blaze, But with institutions weakening, communities dividing, scholars becoming vulnerable, and the city's old culture losing the people who kept it alive. Number 4. Hypatia's death and the vanishing scholarly community. If the Serapeum's destruction shows us that a building can fall without proving the total destruction of every book connected to it, Hypatia shows us something even more unsettling. A scholarly world can survive the fall of its buildings, then begin to disappear when the people who make that world function are no longer safe. Hypatia of Alexandria was not the keeper of some final secret library. There is no reliable ancient source that places her in charge of a surviving great library, guarding the last shelves of lost Greek wisdom while mobs gathered outside. That image is powerful. It appears again and again in modern retellings. But it is almost certainly a later fantasy. The real Hypatia was important enough without it. She was a philosopher, mathematician, astronomer, and teacher working in Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE. Her father was Theon, himself a respected scholar associated with mathematical and astronomical study. Theon is known for work on texts by Euclid and Ptolemy, two of the giants of ancient science. Euclid was the geometer, whose elements shaped mathematics for more than 2,000 years. Ptolemy was the astronomer and geographer, whose models of the heavens would dominate educated thought across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for centuries. Hypatia grew up inside that world, not the old Ptolemaic Alexandria of royal patronage and legendary mountains of papyrus. That world was long gone. But Alexandria was still a city where educated people argued about philosophy, studied mathematics, observed the sky, copied texts, and fought over what kind of knowledge mattered. It was still a place where old traditions had not vanished completely. They had changed, they had become more fragile, but they were alive, and Hypatia became one of their most visible representatives. The surviving evidence is incomplete, as it so often is with ancient women. We do not have a shelf full of books written in her own hand. We cannot open a surviving manuscript and say, with certainty, this is Hypatia speaking directly to us. Her reputation reaches us mostly through other people, later historians, religious writers, and above all the letters of a former student named Synesius. Those letters matter because they show us something rare. They show a teacher and a student connected by intellectual trust. Synesius came from Cyrene, in what is now Libya, and studied in Alexandria. He later became a Christian bishop, but he remained deeply attached to Hypatia. In his letters, he asks her for help with instruments, scientific questions, and practical problems. He addresses her with reverence, not as a curiosity, not as an entertainer, as a serious intellectual authority. Imagine what that means. A student who would go on to become a bishop still writes to his former teacher for guidance on technical and philosophical matters. That tells us Hypatia's classroom was not some isolated corner of pagan nostalgia. It was part of a living network. Students came to Alexandria, learned from her, then carried ideas, books, methods, and personal connections out into the wider Mediterranean world. That is how ancient scholarship survived, not through one magical library building. Through networks, a teacher explains a difficult theorem to a student. The student copies a text, a patron funds a manuscript. A friend sends a letter asking for a calculation. A scholar compares two versions of an old work and corrects an error. Someone builds an instrument. Someone else teaches the method to the next generation. Each step seems small, but together they keep an intellectual tradition alive. Hypatia stood near the center of one of those networks. She taught a form of philosophy often called Neoplatonism. Now, that word can make it sound like she was teaching something distant and obscure, a fog of mystical ideas floating above the real world. But Neoplatonic philosophy was much more ambitious than that. It was an attempt to understand reality as a coherent whole, the nature of the soul, the structure of the cosmos, the relationship between mathematics and truth, and the possibility that disciplined reasoning could lift the human mind toward a deeper understanding of the universe. For Hypatia and her students, mathematics was not just arithmetic for merchants or geometry for surveyors. It was a way of training the mind. A geometric proof showed that reality could be approached through reason. Astronomy revealed patterns in the heavens. Harmonic ratios in music hinted that number itself might lie beneath the visible world. To study these subjects was to practice intellectual discipline. You learned to move from confusion to clarity, from appearance to structure, from individual facts to the principles that connected them. And Alexandria was the perfect place for that kind of work. The city sat between worlds, Greek intellectual traditions, Egyptian religious traditions, Roman administration, Jewish communities, Christian communities, merchants from across the Mediterranean, travellers from the Red Sea and beyond. Languages mixed in the streets. Ships arrived carrying grain, textiles, spices, letters, rumours and books. Alexandria could be brutal, crowded and unstable. But it was also one of the few places in the late Roman world where a person like Hypatia could gather students around her and teach advanced philosophy, mathematics and astronomy. Ancient accounts describe her moving publicly through the city, teaching openly, speaking with powerful people, and earning extraordinary respect. One historian wrote that she surpassed the philosophers of her time. Another described crowds gathering around her house. We should be careful with ancient praise. Writers often exaggerate. They turn admired people into symbols, but even allowing for exaggeration, the basic picture is clear. Hypatia was famous. Not famous in the modern sense, with portraits, newspapers and recorded speeches. Famous in the ancient sense, her name travelled. Students remembered her. Officials knew her. Rivals noticed her. Her intellectual authority mattered in a city where authority itself was becoming dangerous. And this is where the story begins to darken. Because being a philosopher was not merely an academic identity in Alexandria. A respected teacher had students. Students had families. Families had patrons, offices, religious loyalties, and enemies. Ideas did not stay safely inside a classroom. They moved through the city attached to real people, real institutions, and real struggles over who had the right to speak, teach, advise, and lead. By the early 5th century, Alexandria was not simply divided into pagans and Christians. That neat story is tempting. It is also far too simple. The city was a pressure cooker of overlapping conflicts. Religious rivalries mattered. Political ambition mattered. Ethnic and communal violence mattered. Imperial law mattered. And beneath all of it was a basic question that had no easy answer. Who actually controlled Alexandria? On one side stood Orestes, the imperial prefect. He was the representative of the Roman state in Egypt, responsible for administration, taxation, public order, and the grain supply that helped feed Constantinople. This was not a ceremonial job. Egypt was one of the most important provinces in the empire. If Alexandria was unstable, the consequences could reach all the way to the imperial capital. On the other side stood Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria. A bishop was supposed to lead the city's Christian community. But in a city like Alexandria, that role could carry enormous political power. Bishops managed wealth, charities, buildings, clerical networks, and vast numbers of loyal followers. They could influence crowds. They could appeal directly to imperial officials. They could define who belonged inside the moral community of the city, and who stood outside it. Cyril had become bishop in 412 CE, after the death of his uncle Theophilus, and he inherited more than a religious office. He inherited a struggle over power that had been building for generations. Remember, Alexandria had a history of public violence long before Hypatia entered the story. Mobs could form quickly. Street fights could become riots. Religious disputes were not debates held in quiet rooms between men with books and candles. They could spill into marketplaces, churches, theatres, government buildings, and neighbourhoods. A rumour could become a confrontation. A confrontation could become a massacre. And every faction understood the same brutal fact. A crowd was political power. Cyril and Orestes were not natural allies. They represented competing sources of authority, the bishop's influence over a militant Christian population, and the prefect's legal authority as the emperor's official. In theory, their responsibilities could overlap peacefully. In practice, each man had reason to see the other as a threat. The conflict began escalating almost immediately. One major flashpoint involved Alexandria's Jewish community, which had lived in the city for centuries and remained an important part of its commercial and cultural life. Ancient accounts describe violent clashes between Jews and Christians, followed by Cyril's expulsion of many Jews from Alexandria and the seizure of property. The details are difficult. Our surviving sources are partisan, and ancient historians often frame violence to favour one side over another. But the political result is clearer. Cyril had acted on a scale that challenged the prefect's authority. Orestes protested to the emperor. He was not merely objecting to a religious dispute. He was defending the power of Roman administration against a bishop who had demonstrated that he could mobilize people and reshape the city without the prefect's consent. Then things got worse. A group of monks from the Nitrian desert came into Alexandria to support Cyril. These were not quiet scholars arriving for a theological discussion. They were a large, intensely committed force, ready to confront the prefect in the streets. According to the historian Socrates Scholasticus, they surrounded Orestes and accused him of being a pagan. Orestes, who had been baptized, denied it. The accusation was not really about theology. It was a political weapon. If you could portray the imperial prefect as an enemy of Christianity, then resisting him could look like religious duty. One monk named Ammonius threw a stone that struck Orestes in the head. The prefect was wounded. His guards fled. For a moment, the man responsible for imperial order in Alexandria was surrounded by an angry religious crowd and nearly overwhelmed. Think about what that revealed. The city had reached a point where a bishop's supporters could physically attack the emperor's representative in public. And the prefect, despite all the authority of Rome behind him, could not assume he would be protected. Orestes had Ammonius arrested and tortured to death. Cyril later honoured the monk as a martyr, but even some Christians objected. A man who attacks a public official and dies under punishment is not automatically a martyr, no matter how useful the label may be. The disagreement mattered because it showed the struggle was not simply Christian versus non-Christian. Christians themselves disagreed about violence, authority, and what kind of leader Cyril should be. This is the world Hypatia was living in, not a calm academy surrounded by chaos somewhere else. She was connected to Orestes. Ancient sources say the prefect consulted her, and that she had influence with him. That may have been perfectly ordinary. A powerful official seeking advice from a famous philosopher was not unusual. But in a city poisoned by suspicion, ordinary contact could be turned into evidence of conspiracy. Soon a story began circulating. Hypatia, people claimed, was the reason Orestes and Cyril could not reconcile. Maybe she was using philosophy to manipulate the prefect. Maybe she was blocking peace. Maybe she represented the old intellectual elite, resisting Christian authority. Maybe she was simply a visible woman with public influence, and that alone made her an easy target. We do not know exactly who started the accusations. We do know what happened when they took hold. In Alexandria, a rumour did not need to be true to become dangerous. It only needed to fit the fears of people already looking for someone to blame. And by the early spring of 415, those fears were about to find Hypatia in the street. What happened next was horrifying, but the story people later told about it was, in some ways, even more powerful. A Christian mob seized Hypatia in 415 CE, dragged her to the Serapeum, a former imperial building that had become a church, and killed her. The exact details vary depending on which ancient source you read. Some accounts are closer to the event than others. Some were written by people with their own religious and political loyalties. But the central fact is not seriously in doubt. A renowned philosopher was murdered by a mob in Alexandria. That fact was shocking enough. It did not need embellishment. But over the centuries, Hypatia's death became attached to another story. The story of the Library of Alexandria. And eventually, in popular memory, the two became almost impossible to separate. You have probably heard the version already. Hypatia is imagined as the last librarian of Alexandria. She is pictured guarding the final scrolls of the ancient world. Then, a fanatical Christian mob storms the library, murders its brilliant female keeper, and burns the last surviving books of Greek science, philosophy, and pagan wisdom. It is a dramatic story. It has everything: a doomed genius, a lost archive, religious violence, forbidden knowledge, and the final darkness descending over the classical world. There is only one enormous problem. The ancient sources describing Hypatia's death do not say she was the librarian of the Great Library. They do not say she was killed inside the Great Library, and they do not describe a library burning alongside her. In fact, by 415 CE, the famous Mausian library, if any part of it had survived in an institutional form, had already vanished from our records centuries earlier. That does not mean every book in Alexandria was gone. Far from it. Books could survive in private hands, schools, churches, government offices, and scattered collections. But the specific institution people picture when they say the Library of Alexandria is not documented as standing there in Hypatia's lifetime, waiting to be destroyed. So how did the connection become so popular? Part of the answer is simple. Hypatia fit the role too perfectly. She was a woman of learning in a city famous for learning. She lived in Alexandria. She taught philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. She was killed during an era of fierce religious conflict, and she died after the Serapeum had been demolished, after the old pagan institutions had been weakened, after centuries of wars, fires, and political upheaval had already damaged the city's intellectual landscape. To later writers, she looked like the final candle in a room going dark. And once that image takes hold, people begin filling in the gaps. The library becomes her library. The books become the books she was defending. Her murder becomes the final destruction of ancient knowledge. A messy political crime becomes a single, clean historical turning point. But history is rarely that clean. The closest early account comes from Socrates Scholasticus, a Christian historian writing not long after the event. He admired Hypatia's learning and condemned her murder. That alone should complicate the simple version of the story. Socrates did not portray her as a librarian defending a pagan archive. He described her as a philosopher whose reputation and public influence made her vulnerable in a dangerous political conflict. Later writers added their own layers. The pagan philosopher Damascius, writing about a century after Hypatia's death, gave a more dramatic and hostile account of Cyril's role. Centuries later still, John of Nicaea wrote about Hypatia from a very different Christian perspective, presenting her as a figure associated with pagan practices and political manipulation. These accounts do not agree on tone, motive, or meaning. But none gives us the scene modern audiences often expect. Hypatia standing amid shelves of scrolls while the great library goes up in flames. That scene is a reconstruction, not evidence. And it kept growing because it served different purposes for different generations. During the Enlightenment, writers looking back at the ancient world saw Hypatia as a martyr for reason against religious intolerance. In the 19th century, novelists and painters turned her into a symbol of lost beauty, lost freedom, and lost pagan civilization. In the 20th and 21st centuries, documentaries, novels, internet posts, and films often merged every Alexandrian catastrophe into one emotional event. Caesar's fire, the destruction of the Serapeum, Hypatia's murder, the disappearance of the scholarly community, the supposed final loss of the library, different centuries, different buildings, different conflicts, one legend. And that is exactly why Alexandria is so difficult to untangle. The city suffered so many real disasters that people do not need to invent tragedy. But when the evidence is incomplete, the temptation is to gather every disaster into the same story and give it one villain, one fire, one final night. If you enjoy mysteries where the popular version is compelling but the evidence is stranger, the book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description. Hypatia's death deserves to be remembered, not because she was the last librarian in a story we wish had happened, but because her actual death tells us something more disturbing. Knowledge does not only disappear when buildings burn. Sometimes the people who teach it become targets. Sometimes their students scatter. Sometimes public trust collapses. Sometimes a city becomes too dangerous for open inquiry to survive in the form it once had. And that raises the next question. If Hypatia was not killed in the final burning of the Great Library, what exactly had happened to Alexandria's scholarly world by the time she died? The answer is not a single date. It is a process. By the 5th century, Alexandria still had educated people. It still had teachers, readers, physicians, lawyers, administrators, clergy, and students. It still produced texts. It still mattered. This was not a city where every scroll had suddenly vanished, and every educated person had forgotten how to think. But the old scholarly ecosystem was changing, and an ecosystem is the important word. A great centre of learning is never just a building full of books. It depends on teachers who can train students, students who have enough security and money to study, patrons willing to pay salaries and copy manuscripts, scribes who know the languages, craftsmen who can make papyrus, parchment, ink, and bindings, merchants who can move books between cities, officials who tolerate disagreement, families who believe an education is worth pursuing. Break enough of those connections, and the institution can die without anyone setting a single shelf on fire. Think about a university today. The campus could remain standing. The library building could still be there. The books could still sit in climate-controlled rooms. But imagine the funding disappears. Professors leave. Students stop enrolling. The language needed to read the oldest materials is no longer taught. Political pressure makes certain subjects dangerous. The city becomes unstable. Copying and preserving texts becomes too expensive. Within a generation or two, you might still have the building, but you no longer have the university. Something like that is what happened to Alexandria's ancient scholarly world. The Mausian had depended on royal and imperial support. For centuries, that support had given scholars unusual privileges, salaries, food, housing, status, and time. Time to compare manuscripts, time to calculate astronomical tables. Time to argue over philosophy, grammar, medicine, geography, and mathematics. But institutions built around elite patronage are fragile. When the money, protection, or political value disappears, the work becomes much harder to sustain. And late antique Alexandria was not a stable place for old institutions to quietly carry on. The city had endured civil conflict, imperial struggles, religious confrontation, economic pressure, and repeated changes in who held power. Its cultural life did not simply stop. It transformed. Christian schools, churches, monasteries, and new networks of learning became increasingly important. Some classical texts continued to be read, copied, quoted, and taught within those new worlds. Others became less useful, less acceptable, less available, or simply harder to understand. That last part matters more than people realize. A text can survive physically and still be effectively lost. If no one can read the language, interpret the references, explain the technical vocabulary, or recognize why the text matters, then the knowledge inside it becomes silent. A mathematical treatise without trained mathematicians is just ink on a page. An astronomical table without the tradition that explains its calculations is a puzzle. A philosophical dialogue without teachers to guide students through it can become a strange relic from a vanished mental universe. This is why manuscript copying was so crucial. Ancient books did not survive by sitting untouched for 2,000 years. Papyrus decayed, ink faded, pages tore, insects, moisture, fire, neglect, and ordinary use all took their toll. For a work to survive, someone usually had to copy it again and again, century after century. Every copy was an act of selection. Someone had to decide, this one is worth the labour. And that decision was never neutral. A monastery might preserve theological writings, biblical commentaries, sermons, and selected classical authors useful for education. A school might favour grammar, rhetoric, logic, and medicine. An official might preserve legal texts. A wealthy collector might keep poetry. But thousands of works had no such protection, not necessarily because anyone hated them. Sometimes there was simply no demand, no patron, no copyist, no reader, no next copy. That is how whole categories of knowledge can disappear, not with one spectacular act of destruction, but through countless small decisions made over centuries. One damaged manuscript not repaired, one teacher not replaced, one school closing after its patron dies, one family fleeing violence with only what they can carry, one generation learning a different curriculum, one old text judged too obscure to copy when parchment is expensive. Then another, then another. By the time people realize something is gone, it has often been gone for generations. Hypatia's murder belongs in that larger story. It was not the documented final burning of the Library of Alexandria, but it was a warning of what a fractured city could lose. Her death showed that public intellectual life could become entangled with power struggles so dangerous that even a famous teacher was not safe. It showed that prestige, learning, and personal connections were no guarantee of protection when politics turned violent. And when scholars no longer feel secure, they leave if they can. They teach more cautiously. They avoid controversial subjects. They stop gathering students in public. Their pupils seek safer careers. The conversation shrinks, not all at once, but steadily. Alexandria did not become an empty intellectual wasteland in 415. That would be another myth. The city remained important in Christian theology, medicine, trade, administration, and scholarship for centuries. Greek learning continued in many places. Ancient texts travelled through Byzantine, Syriac, Arabic, Jewish, Latin, and later Renaissance networks. Some works once associated with Alexandria survived because they were copied far from Alexandria. But the particular community that had made the city the ancient Mediterranean's most famous research centre was no longer what it had been. The library did not need one final blaze to vanish. Its supporting world had been weakened, divided, repurposed, and gradually replaced. The shelves, wherever they were only part of the story. The real library had always been people. Readers, teachers, scribes, patrons, and students, all keeping knowledge alive by passing it forward. When that chain breaks, flames are optional, and that is why the last great legend is so tempting. If people cannot find one final fire in Alexandria's story, they go looking for one somewhere else. A conqueror arrives in 642 CE, an ancient city changes hands, and suddenly there is a tale of books burned for months in the city's baths. It is one of the most famous stories ever told about the library, and it may be the least reliable of them all. Number 5. The Arab Conquest legend of 642 CE. This is the story most people think they know. Alexandria falls to the armies of the early Islamic Caliphate. The commander Amr ibn al-As enters one of the greatest cities of the Mediterranean world. Somewhere in the city, according to the legend, there is still a vast collection of ancient books, scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of Greece, Egypt, Rome, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, everything. Amr supposedly writes to the Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, asking what should be done with them. And Umar gives an answer so cold, so simple, so perfectly dramatic, that it has survived for centuries. If the books agree with the Quran, the story says, then they are unnecessary. If they disagree with the Quran, then they are dangerous. Either way, burn them. The books are then allegedly distributed to Alexandria's public baths, where they are used as fuel. Not for a night, not for a week. The story says there are so many manuscripts that the baths burn on them for 6 months. 6 months. It is the kind of detail that makes a story feel real. You can almost picture it. Bathhouse attendants feeding armfuls of scrolls into furnaces, smoke rising over the harbour, the old world literally going up in flames while a new world takes its place. And that is exactly why the story is so powerful. It gives the Library of Alexandria a final ending. Not a confusing sequence of damage, decline, political upheaval, institutional collapse, changing religious priorities, lost copying networks, and gradual disappearance. No. It gives us a villain, an order, a fire, and a date. 642 CE, case closed, except history is almost never that neat. First, it helps to understand why this particular legend has such a grip on the imagination. The conquest of Alexandria was real. In the early 640s, Arab Muslim armies took control of Egypt from the Byzantine Empire. The city had been fought over before. It had changed rulers before. But this was a major transition. Alexandria had been part of the Roman and then Byzantine world for centuries. Now it became part of a rapidly expanding caliphate stretching across the Middle East and North Africa. That kind of political transformation creates a perfect setting for stories of cultural destruction. People expect conquerors to destroy what came before. Sometimes they do. Armies sack cities, buildings are looted, archives disappear, temples are damaged, officials flee. Wealthy families carry away what they can. War is never gentle with fragile things. But expectation is not evidence. The legend adds another figure to make everything feel even more personal. A philosopher named John Philoponus. In some versions, Philoponus sees the books and begs Amr ibn al-As to spare them. He tells the commander that these are not ordinary objects. They contain the achievements of generations. They are worth more than the material they are written on. Amr, according to the tale, refuses to decide on his own. He sends the question to Umar, and then comes the famous judgment. If what is in these books agrees with the Quran, we have no need of them. If it contradicts the Quran, destroy them. It is a devastating line. It has the rhythm of a proverb. It reduces an entire civilization's intellectual inheritance to a single test: useful or useless, orthodox or dangerous, keep nothing. But notice how perfectly the quote serves the story. It turns a messy historical transition into a clash between two worlds. On one side, ancient Greek learning, Euclid, Archimedes, Hippocrates, Aristotle, the astronomers, the poets, the geographers. On the other side, a conquering religious authority presented as indifferent to every form of knowledge outside one sacred text. That image has been repeated so often that many people assume it must come directly from an eyewitness account. They imagine a chronicler standing in Alexandria in 642, watching the final destruction of the ancient library and recording Umar's words for posterity. But that is already getting ahead of ourselves. For now, stay with the mechanics of the legend, because they reveal what people wanted this story to mean. The baths are especially important. Ancient and medieval cities had public bathhouses, and bathhouses required constant fuel. Wood was expensive. Fuel had to be gathered, transported, stored, and burned day after day. So the idea of using books as fuel has a horrible practical logic to it. A scroll is made of papyrus. Papyrus burns. A manuscript is vulnerable. Knowledge becomes heat, ash, and nothing else. It is an image designed to make readers feel the loss physically. Not merely that books were destroyed, but that they were treated as worthless. That the greatest writings of the ancient world were reduced to kindling for bath water. And 6 months is not just a number, it is a claim about scale. Imagine how enormous the collection would have to be. Enough material to keep the furnaces of Alexandria's baths going through half a year. That detail transforms the library from an uncertain historical institution, altered and scattered over centuries, into something almost mythical, a single surviving mountain of books waiting for one final act of annihilation. There is another reason the story spreads so easily. It answers a question people desperately want answered. Where did all the lost books go? Why do we have only fragments of so many ancient writers? Why do we know the titles of works that no longer exist? Why are so many discoveries, arguments, experiments, and observations preserved only through quotations by later authors? A single fire is emotionally satisfying. It gives loss a face. And when the face belongs to a conqueror from a rival civilization, the legend becomes even more useful. It can be repeated as a warning. It can be used in religious arguments. It can be used in political arguments. It can be used to explain why the modern world inherited only part of the ancient one. If you want to go deeper into the strange gaps, vanished records, and historical puzzles that refuse to stay solved, the book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description. But before we decide whether Umar ever gave that order, we need to slow down and ask a much less dramatic question. What exactly is the trail of evidence behind this famous story? The trail is much thinner than most retellings suggest. There is no surviving eyewitness account from Alexandria in 642 describing this event. No contemporary letter from a frightened scholar. No administrative record listing confiscated manuscripts. No report from the conquering army saying, yes, the books were taken. The caliph was consulted. The baths received the fuel. And that silence matters. Not because silence proves nothing happened. History is full of real events that left few records. Documents rot. Archives burn. Languages disappear. Governments collapse. The people who could have written about an event may never have considered it important enough to record. But when a story is this enormous, this specific, and this morally perfect, historians expect to find it showing up early. They expect it to appear in the accounts closest to the conquest, in the histories written by Christians living under the new rulers, in Byzantine complaints about the loss of Egypt, in early Islamic chronicles recording the astonishing expansion of the caliphate, in the writings of scholars who had every reason to mourn the destruction of Greek learning. Instead, for centuries, the record is quiet. Early Muslim historians describe the conquest of Egypt. They discuss commanders, battles, taxes, treaties, cities changing hands, political rivalries, and the enormous difficulty of holding newly conquered territory. But they do not give us this great burning of Alexandria's books. Christian writers from the region had reasons to resent conquest, reasons to record violence, confiscation, and humiliation. Yet they do not preserve the story either. Byzantine writers, who saw Egypt as a lost province and the Arab advance as a disaster, do not point to a 6-month destruction of the ancient world's greatest library. Think about how strange that is. If a rival army had destroyed a massive surviving collection of pagan Greek and scientific literature, and if the destruction had been justified with a line rejecting every book outside a sacred text, this would have been propaganda gold. It would have been repeated again and again. It would have become a symbol almost immediately. But it doesn't seem to appear where we would expect it first. The detailed versions emerge much later, in medieval sources written roughly 6 centuries after the conquest itself. 6 centuries. Put that distance in perspective. For us, 6 centuries ago was the early 1400s. It was before the Protestant Reformation, before Columbus reached the Americas, before the printing press transformed Europe. Imagine trying to reconstruct a precise conversation from that era, word for word, including a dramatic legal judgment and an exact 6-month timetable based on authors writing today. Possible, maybe, if they had access to excellent lost records. But that is the problem. We cannot simply assume they did. One of the best-known versions appears in the work of Ibn al-Kifti, a 13th century scholar and official. Another was repeated by the Syriac Christian writer Bar Hebraeus, later in that same century. These authors were not stupid. They were educated men working in serious intellectual traditions. But neither was standing in Alexandria in 642. Neither was a contemporary witness. They were collecting, transmitting, and shaping material that had passed through generations of storytelling. And every generation changes a story. Names get attached to anonymous events. Exact numbers replace vague phrases. Conversations become quotations. A rumour becomes an anecdote. An anecdote becomes history because it has been copied enough times that people stop asking where it began. This is one of the central rules of historical detective work. A source is not automatically reliable because it is old. The real question is, how old is it compared with the event? Who wrote it? What did they have access to? What were they trying to explain? And does anyone closer to the event support them? The later accounts of Alexandria struggle on almost every one of those questions. They arrive late. They preserve a story with suspiciously polished, dramatic structure. And they appear after centuries in which Greek philosophy, Islamic scholarship, Christian polemic, and political conflict had become deeply entangled. That context matters because medieval writers were not just preserving facts. They were arguing about civilization. They were debating faith and reason, revelation and philosophy, Greek learning and religious authority. They were living in a world where ancient texts had become symbols in larger arguments. So a story about a caliph ordering the destruction of pagan books was not merely a report about Alexandria. It was a perfect weapon. For some readers, it proved that religious zeal destroys knowledge. For others, it could be retold, revised, or rejected as part of a struggle over the legacy of Greek thought. Either way, the story had enormous value long after the alleged event. And the more useful a story becomes, the more carefully we have to inspect it. There is also a detail buried inside the narrative that should make us pause before we even reach the question of manuscripts. The philosopher said to be involved in the episode was John Philoponus. but Philoponus had likely died decades before the Arab conquest of Alexandria. And once that timeline starts to unravel, the entire legend begins to look less like a report carried forward from 642, and more like a story assembled later from pieces that were never meant to fit together. And that brings us to the question hiding underneath the legend. What exactly was still in Alexandria when the Arab army arrived? Because the famous story only works if we imagine the original Library of Alexandria still standing there in 642. Vast halls, endless shelves, hundreds of thousands of scrolls waiting for one final catastrophe. But by then, Alexandria had already lived through nearly 7 centuries of political violence, religious conflict, economic change, and institutional decline. The city was still important, still huge, still one of the great urban centres of the Eastern Mediterranean. Its harbour connected Egypt to trade routes reaching toward Constantinople, Syria, North Africa, and beyond. It had churches, markets, baths, warehouses, government offices, workshops, and neighbourhoods packed with people speaking Greek, Coptic, Syriac, Latin, and increasingly Arabic. But the Alexandria of 642 was not the Alexandria of Cleopatra. The original Maution, the institution associated with the ancient Great Library, had almost certainly ceased to exist in its classical form long before the conquest. We do not know the exact moment it disappeared. That is one of the problems with this entire history. There is no neat date, no single final inventory, no official announcement saying the library is now closed forever. Instead, there are fragments. A reference here, a silence there, a scholar no longer described as working at the Maution, a district damaged in war, an institution fading from the records until it becomes impossible to tell whether it still existed or whether people simply kept using the old name for a much smaller reality. By the 3rd century, the old scholarly world had been hit hard by civil war. During the fighting connected with the Emperor Aurelian, parts of the Bruchion, the royal quarter where the Maution had once stood, were devastated. That does not prove every surviving book vanished in that moment, but it does mean the physical and financial foundation of the old institution may already have been badly damaged. And a library is not just books. This is the part people miss. A library survives through salaries, buildings, patrons, scribes, catalogues, repairs, teachers, guards, and generations of people who believe preserving old texts is worth the cost. Remove those things and the collection begins to scatter, even if no one ever lights a match. Scrolls are copied into smaller collections. Valuable works travel with scholars. Damaged texts are discarded. Papyrus decays in humidity. Funding dries up. Buildings get repurposed. A great institution does not always die dramatically. Sometimes it dies the way an old language dies. Fewer people speak it each year, until one day everyone realizes it is gone. There was also the Serapeum, the temple complex often described as housing a daughter library. But that site was destroyed in the late 4th century, during the religious conflicts that transformed Alexandria. Once again, we cannot say exactly how many books were there at the end, or what happened to each manuscript. Some may have been removed earlier, some may have been destroyed. Some may have survived in private hands. But whatever collection existed at the Serapeum, it was no longer waiting intact for the conquerors of 642. By the time the Arabs entered the city, the real question was not, did they find the ancient Great Library? The evidence strongly suggests that the famous institution had already been gone, transformed or dispersed for centuries. That does not mean Alexandria had become intellectually empty. Far from it. This is where the story gets more interesting than the legend. Alexandria remained a city of books, teachers, debates, and specialized knowledge. Christian scholarship had become central to urban life. Clergy needed texts. Lawyers needed records, administrators needed documents. Physicians needed medical writings, philosophers and commentators still worked with Greek traditions, even as the religious and political world around them changed. Books had not vanished. They had changed homes. Instead of one giant royal institution gathering knowledge under a single roof, learning was spread across churches, monasteries, schools, private households, and professional networks. A physician might own medical treatises. A teacher might preserve copies of Aristotle or Euclid. A monastery might maintain biblical manuscripts, commentaries, letters, and saints' lives. Government offices kept legal and tax records. Wealthy families could possess small but valuable libraries. Think of it less like a single super library and more like a city-wide web. Cut one thread, and knowledge can still survive somewhere else. But the web is also vulnerable in a different way. No one building has to burn for the whole system to weaken. A generation of unrest can break connections. A language shift can make texts unreadable. A change in education can make copying certain books seem unnecessary. Knowledge can disappear book by book, school by school, reader by reader. And Alexandria had already experienced exactly that kind of pressure. Before the Arab conquest, the city had passed through Byzantine religious disputes so bitter that communities fought over theology, church authority, and imperial power. Then came the Persian invasion and occupation in the early 7th century. Then the Byzantines returned. Then, only a few years later, the Arab armies arrived. Imagine trying to maintain fragile manuscript collections through that. Every war disrupts trade. Every siege threatens food supplies. Every change of ruler reshuffles patronage. Scholars leave. Scribes lose work. Buildings are damaged. The manuscripts most likely to survive are the ones somebody actively needs, copies, protects, and carries away. Which means that by 642, Alexandria may still have held important books. It may have had substantial collections, but there is no good reason to picture a single untouched archive containing the accumulated intellectual treasure of antiquity. And that distinction changes everything, because if there was no intact great library to destroy, then the story of a single order wiping out ancient knowledge begins to collapse under its own scale. But it also raises a harder question. If the books were already scattered, diminished and vulnerable, what happened to Alexandria's remaining scholarly world after the conquest? Some scholars did leave. Some institutions changed. Greek gradually lost its old dominance as Arabic became the language of administration, scholarship, and elite culture across Egypt. That shift mattered enormously. A book does not have to be burned to become inaccessible. If fewer people can read the language it was written in, fewer people can copy it. If fewer people copy it, every damaged manuscript becomes a possible dead end. But here is the irony. The Arab conquest is often remembered as the moment ancient learning was supposedly extinguished. In the centuries that followed, Arabic-speaking scholars became some of the most important preservers, translators, critics, and expanders of Greek learning anywhere in the world. Works by Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, and many others moved through Syriac and Arabic scholarly networks. They were translated, argued over, corrected, summarized and developed into new fields of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, optics, philosophy, and geography. Not every Greek text survived, far from it. But the history is not a simple story of one civilization inheriting knowledge while another destroys it. It is a story of transmission, messy transmission, uneven transmission, sometimes brilliant, sometimes tragic. A manuscript copied in Alexandria might end up in a monastery. A Syriac translation might preserve a Greek work whose original version later disappeared. An Arabic commentary might preserve quotations from a lost book. A text ignored in one century could become essential in another. Knowledge moved like water through a broken landscape, splitting into channels, disappearing underground, resurfacing somewhere unexpected. And that is precisely why the 642 legend became so powerful. It gave people a clean answer to a complicated loss. For centuries, people looking at the ruins of the ancient world wanted to know who had done it, who had broken the chain between the achievements of classical Greece and Rome and the world that came after, who had destroyed the books, who had extinguished the light. The legend supplied a villain, a date, an order, and a fire. It turned a long historical process into a single scene. Picture how satisfying that is. You do not have to think about centuries of underfunding, war, religious conflict, decay, political instability, changing languages, changing schools, dispersed collections, and the brutal fact that fragile manuscripts survive only when someone keeps copying them. You just need one ruler and one catastrophic decision. That is the emotional engine of the story. And once a story has that kind of engine, it travels. In medieval polemics, the tale could be used to portray Muslim conquerors as enemies of learning. In later European writing, especially during periods when Christian Europe was defining itself against the Islamic world, the story became a convenient symbol. It fit a larger narrative in which the ancient classical world was imagined as rational and enlightened, the medieval world as dark and destructive, and Islamic civilization as an invading force standing outside the inheritance of antiquity. But history refuses to cooperate with that script. Islamic scholars did not stand outside the classical tradition. They were among its major heirs. They preserved parts of it, transformed parts of it, and built new intellectual traditions that later influenced Europe itself. The same world accused in the legend of burning Greek books helped carry Greek philosophy, science, and medicine into new languages and new institutions. That does not mean every conquest was peaceful. It does not mean Arab rule caused no disruption in Alexandria. Conquest always brings violence, uncertainty, taxes, political change, and suffering. People lose homes, communities fracture, old systems of patronage collapse. Some books absolutely may have been lost during those turbulent centuries, but that is different from claiming that one command destroyed the great library in a single final act. The difference matters because legends shape what we look for. If you believe ancient knowledge vanished in one fire, then you stop asking harder questions. Which texts survived? Who copied them? Which languages carried them forward? Which communities valued them and which stopped teaching them? Why do some authors survive in dozens of manuscripts while others vanish except for a sentence quoted by an enemy? Those questions lead to a stranger and more human history. A history where knowledge is never fully safe, where every book depends on chains of people who may never know how important their work will become. A tired scribe copying a medical treatise, a monk preserving a damaged manuscript. A teacher explaining geometry to students. A translator struggling to find an Arabic word for a Greek philosophical idea. A family carrying books away from a city under siege. If you enjoy mysteries where the real answer is more complicated than the famous story, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available through the website link in the description. Because Alexandria is only one example of how history can turn uncertainty into certainty, and fragments into legends. The burning library story also shaped modern popular memory because it became shorthand for all lost knowledge. People hear Alexandria, and they imagine inventions centuries ahead of their time. Lost machines, secret maps, medical cures, philosophical breakthroughs, entire sciences erased by flames. Maybe some extraordinary works really were lost. Almost certainly many were. We know of ancient books that survived only as titles in catalogues, quotations in later authors, or brief references from readers who assumed everyone would always have access to them. They were wrong, But the loss was not one night, not one army, not one pyre burning for months. It was accumulation. One war damages a district, one temple closes, one school loses funding, one generation stops learning Greek, one collection is scattered, one manuscript is not recopied before it rots. Then another. Then another. By the time later writers look back, the disappearance is so vast that it feels impossible to explain without a single enormous catastrophe. So they create one. That is the final twist in the Alexandria story. The legend of 642 may tell us less about what happened to the ancient library than about what later generations needed history to mean. They needed a moment when the door closed, a culprit they could name, a flame they could picture. But the real Library of Alexandria did not burn once. It faded, fractured, moved, changed, and was repeatedly damaged across centuries of upheaval. Its knowledge did not simply vanish. Some of it died. Some of it survived. Some of it travelled farther than anyone in ancient Alexandria could have imagined. And that leaves us with the bigger question. How many other lost knowledge stories are really not stories of one disaster, but of 1,000 smaller losses nobody bothered to remember? Maybe that is why Alexandria still matters. Not because it was one building with one impossible collection of every book ever written. Not because a single fire erased a secret ancient super-civilization. And not because one villain, one emperor, one bishop, one mob, or one conqueror can be made responsible for everything that disappeared. Alexandria matters because it shows us how knowledge is actually lost. Not usually in one spectacular moment, usually through a chain of moments. Caesar's fire in 48 BCE may have destroyed books near the harbour, perhaps storehouses and commercial collections tied to the city's book trade. But the evidence does not clearly prove that it consumed the entire Mausian library in one world-ending inferno. Later writers looked back at the flames and saw the beginning of a legend. But even after Caesar, Alexandria remained a major intellectual centre. Scholars still worked there, books still existed there. The city was wounded, it was not necessarily empty. Then came the 3rd century. Civil war, Aurelian's campaigns. Fighting through the Bruchion, the old royal quarter where the Mausian had once stood. This may have been one of the most devastating stages in the long disappearance. Not because we can point to one surviving document that says, here is the exact moment the library died. We cannot. But because cities do not survive street-by-street warfare unchanged. Buildings collapse, archives scatter, patrons flee. Teachers lose students. A scholarly institution can be destroyed even if nobody ever lights a ceremonial match. Then came the Serapeum in 391 CE. The great temple was demolished amid religious conflict, and whatever books remained in its associated collections were placed in danger. But even here, the story is more complicated than the popular version. The Serapeum was not automatically the original Great Library. It may have held books, it may have preserved a later branch or related collection. But the evidence does not let us turn its destruction into the final burning of everything Alexandria had ever known. Then there was Hypatia. Her death was not the destruction of a library. It was something, in a way, more revealing. A scholar can be killed. A school can be intimidated. A community can lose the people who know how to teach, calculate, debate, copy, and preserve. Books are fragile, but institutions are fragile too. And when an intellectual community breaks apart, even surviving texts can become silent. Finally, the famous Arab conquest legend of 642 CE, the cleanest story, the most dramatic story, the one with the neat order and the endless furnaces. and probably the least reliable as a literal account of the Great Library's destruction. The tale appears centuries after the event. It conflicts with what we know about the long decline of Alexandria's ancient institutions. And it ignores one enormous fact. The medieval Islamic world became one of the greatest engines of preservation, translation, and scientific development in human history. So, if the Library of Alexandria did not burn once, what happened? The honest answer is that we do not know every detail. And that is not a failure of history. That is history. We have fragments, contradictory accounts, ruins, later memories, mentions of books that no longer exist. We have a city that changed rulers, religions, languages, economies, and identities over nearly 1,000 years. We have evidence of fires, wars, closures, political purges, neglect, dispersal, and cultural transformation. We have reasons to believe that knowledge was lost at many different points, in many different ways. The library was not simply destroyed, it was unmade, slowly, repeatedly, sometimes violently, sometimes quietly. A book burned in a war is obvious. A book that never gets copied is almost invisible. But the result can be exactly the same. The words vanish. The ideas vanish. The chain between one human mind and another breaks. And maybe that is the lesson hiding beneath all 5 timelines. Civilizations do not lose knowledge only when barbarians arrive at the gates, or when mobs smash statues, or when conquerors set fire to cities. They lose it when institutions are treated as permanent, when teachers are not supported, when archives are neglected, when language barriers grow, when curiosity becomes dangerous. When nobody thinks the old books are worth copying one more time. Because one more copy can be the difference between a lost world and a surviving one. Somewhere right now there may be a text we consider ordinary that future generations will see as irreplaceable. Some archive, some language, some field of knowledge that survives only because a few people still care enough to preserve it. That is the real Library of Alexandria. Not a single room full of scrolls. A promise that knowledge survives only when people choose to carry it forward. If this changed how you think about Alexandria, kindly like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment. Which of these 5 timelines do you think was the most important? Caesar's fire, Aurelian's war, the Serapeum's destruction, Hypatia's murder, or the 642 Conquest legend? And where are you listening from? I always want to know how far these old stories are travelling. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify through the link in the description. Every listen helps keep these forgotten, disputed, and deeply human stories alive. Because the Library of Alexandria may be gone, but the fight against forgetting never ended.